Number 1, Kimethia Coleman. Kimethia Coleman was 26 years old and working in various service sector jobs when in January 2012, she was convicted of second-degree murder for the killing of her boyfriend, Air Force Staff Sergeant Brian Spinks. She grew up in Minden, Louisiana, saw herself as outgoing and was known by friends and neighbors as someone eager for social acceptance. Prior to the tragedy, her public image was that of a former prom queen who enjoyed nightlife and maintained seemingly normal relationships. In the months leading up to the bloody incident, sources indicate tension surfaced in the relationship. Brian had returned from Afghanistan and had dated Coleman for over a year. Friends later described Kim as increasingly jealous and controlling, checking his phone and objecting if he spent time with others. When Brian ended the relationship by phone the morning of January 17th, 2010, that appears to have triggered her emotional crisis. The claim of domestic strife and a breakup became central to her defense. Just before 4:00 a.m., Coleman called 911 from Spinks's apartment in Shreveport, reporting she'd been attacked. First responders arrived to find Spinks suffering fatal wounds, stabbed over 60 times, his throat slashed, and Coleman crying, covered in blood, with multiple minor wounds. 2 kitchen knives lay nearby. She initially claimed a man with dreadlocks had followed and attacked both of them, then later said she acted in self-defense after Brian grabbed and wounded her. The victims were intimately close. She was his girlfriend, and he, a U.S. airman. No graphic details are necessary. Focus instead on the violent escalation and blurred boundary between claim and reality. Witnesses said Coleman had threatened Spinks earlier at a club, and voicemail messages from him indicated he intended to end the relationship. After initially persuading officers of her intruder story, investigators uncovered that the wounds she claimed were from an attacker were self-inflicted. Forensic evidence paired with changing statements put her credibility in serious doubt. Once police questioned the inconsistencies, Coleman admitted her story had changed. She claimed self-defense, then insanity, alleging post-traumatic stress from alleged abuse. Yet repeated mental evaluations found her competent to stand trial. The defense tried to raise battered woman syndrome and PTSD, but the jury ultimately rejected those claims. Coleman was arrested and formally charged with second-degree murder. After a 6-day trial in May 2012, the jury found her guilty. She received the mandatory sentence, life in prison at hard labor without possibility of parole, probation, or suspension. She remains incarcerated in Louisiana. Appeals were denied and her conviction affirmed by the appellate court in July 2013. Observers and psychologists noted a possible pattern: escalating jealousy, emotional volatility after the breakup, and an inability to accept rejection. Expert testimony described a lack of impulse control and a moment of emotional collapse. No formal major psychiatric diagnosis was recorded, but defense arguments portrayed her as distraught, unstable, emotionally overwhelmed. In her own courtroom, breakdown played on audio. Coleman can be heard sobbing as the 911 tape was played, Spinks moaning faintly in the background, and tears flowed from both sides of the courtroom. That haunting scene underscored how grief, guilt, and shock intertwined in the space between crisis and confession. In the end, this case boils down to a fatal mix of emotional intensity and denial, a breakup jealousy turned violent and conflicting narratives about self-defense versus deliberate attack. She once claimed an intruder did it. She once said she defended herself. The jury chose neither story. They saw murder. I must have blanked out, she testified about the stabbing. That lingering question, how pain and rage can erase memory, raises unsettling truths about where vulnerability ends and violence begins. Number 2, Monique Kitts. Monique Kitts was 41 years old and running a daycare center when in November 2014 she was convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit second-degree murder in connection with the July 2010 death of her husband, Corey Kitts. She grew up in Louisiana, married young, and was publicly viewed as a community-oriented mother and business owner, creating an image of a devoted family woman. Over time, tensions in her marriage emerged. Prosecutors portrayed her as dissatisfied, emotionally volatile, and financially motivated. Testimony from a longtime acquaintance revealed that as early as 2006, Monique joked she would be better off without her husband and eventually seriously asked him to find someone to kill Corey. Cell records, cash transfers, and intimate correspondence formed the backdrop of a rising pattern of intent and dissatisfaction. On July 9th, 2010, Corey was discovered in their home in Addis, Louisiana, shot while sleeping. Investigators concluded the victim was shot at point-blank range. DNA evidence later found Monique's and a second minor contributor on her husband. Cell phone logs placed her, the alleged hitman, Carl Howard, and a getaway driver named Corey Knox in frequent contact leading up to the crime. These records suggested planning and coordination. Corey Knox testified that he drove Howard to the Kitts residence on the morning of the killing. Another witness, David Johnson, Monique's former partner, described how he delivered funds from Monique to intermediaries, provided info on Corey's schedule, and helped link her to Howard. Johnson admitted lying to investigators, but insisted the conspiracy existed. The couple's relationship had continued frayed after that 2006 affair, and emails and messages painted Monique as increasingly resentful, craving insurance money and emotional escape. Prosecutors emphasized a life insurance payoff exceeding $500,000 as motive. The investigation began when officers responded to a reported burglary earlier in June where Monique delayed entry and appeared suspicious. On discovering Corey's body the next month, evidence aligned no signs of forced entry, but glass-scattered coins and furnishings disturbed, suggesting staging. Monique was recorded exclaiming at the crime scene, "My God, what have I gone and done?" which investigators documented as a confession of realization rather than stunned innocence. During the trial, the defense portrayed Monique as a grieving wife, denying any involvement and attributing incriminating testimony to unreliable witnesses. She read letters she wrote to Corey on the stand expressing remorse and a desire to rebuild their marriage. Still, the jury found her and Howard guilty after deliberation. The trial lasted about 3 weeks with testimony from 19 witnesses. In March 2015, she was sentenced to life in prison at hard labor without the possibility of parole, consistent with sentencing guidelines for second-degree murder in Louisiana. Appeals and requests for retrial were denied, and the conviction was affirmed on appeal in 2018. Psychological interpretations emphasized greed and resentment as primary motivations. Experts framed Monique as someone who felt trapped emotionally and financially, willing to orchestrate a crime for insurance gain when her efforts to salvage her marriage failed. No serious mental illness diagnosis was presented. Rather, prosecutors framed her as calculating and unsentimental in planning a murder. In the end, Monique Kitts' story is a disturbing portrait of betrayal calculation and shattered trust. A suburban mother turned alleged mastermind, letters pleading for love matched by secret payments, plotting destruction. As she claimed grief evidence suggested motive, and the jury's verdict made one thing clear: they believed the narrative of murder for hire over misplaced emotion. My God, what have I gone and done? That stunned confession echoes the final moments between denial and admission and leaves us asking, when does grief become guilt? And at what point did a plan become irrevocable? Number 3, Stormy Nicole Cofer. Stormy Nicole Cofer was 31 years old and working as a mother and student when in September 2015 she was found guilty of second-degree murder for the shooting death of 18-year-old Kimethia Coleman on October 21st, 2013. She had been living in Rapides Parish, Louisiana, and maintained a public reputation as a caring parent with no prior criminal record. In the months prior to the incident, tensions reportedly rose between Stormy and Kimethia. Allegedly, Kimethia had been involved with Stormy's ex-partner, creating personal conflict. Though details are limited, her defense later raised self-defense, suggesting that threats and prior confrontations may have fed into a moment of fear or misjudgment. There is no record of formal psychiatric diagnoses. Instead, the emotional friction appears rooted in personal relationships and charged circumstances. On October 21st, 2013, Stormy was a passenger in a vehicle during an altercation. She fired a single gunshot through the window, which struck and killed Cayuna Collins. The incident unfolded in public view, and investigators concluded the shot was deliberate, charged as a clear act with intent. Witness testimony and physical evidence gave prosecutors grounds to argue Stormy fired with the specific intent to inflict serious harm or worse. As Cayuna was unarmed and inside another vehicle, the prosecution emphasized the gravity of a passenger opening fire through a closed window. There was no indication of armed threat from the victim. The emotional undertone, a sudden flash of confrontation culminating in tragedy. Stormy maintained she acted in self-defense, but the state countered that no imminent danger could justify firing into a car. The investigation began quickly. Cayuna was identified as the victim of a contact-range shot fired from the passenger side. Stormy was arrested and formally charged with second-degree murder in December 2013. At trial in September 2015, the jury heard argument over her intent, her belief in threat, and the credibility of her version of events. They ultimately rejected self-defense and convicted her. The court denied her post-verdict motions and in January 2016 upheld the life sentence without parole or suspension. Media coverage was limited, with local reports noting the community's shock over the incident, a young teenager killed in a confrontation involving a parent figure. The victim's family sought justice and closure, while Stormy's supporters have since funded petitions and written appeals casting doubt on the conviction. However, appeals courts later affirmed the verdict and sentence, leaving her incarcerated. Psychological interpretation centered less on mental health diagnoses and more on sudden emotional escalation. Experts at trial emphasized that firing a weapon through a closed car window reflects a calculated decision rather than panic or reflex. The state argued that Stormy's actions crossed the line into intentional violence, rejecting her self-defense claims. In the end, this is a case of one fateful moment, a charged personal conflict led to a firearm being discharged, a young life lost, and a life sentence imposed. Stormy once claimed fear and a need to defend herself. The jury concluded she acted with specific intent and rejected the narrative of danger. "I did what I thought I had to do," was how she later expressed her state of mind. But after conviction, that phrase echoes as both defense and dilemma. When does perceived threat justify force? And how does the law weigh intention when tragedy unfolds at a window? Number 4, Margaret Sanchez. Margaret Sanchez was 32 years old when she pleaded guilty in June 2016 to manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to obstruct justice in the death of 22-year-old Jaron Lockhart. At the time, she was not publicly known for any criminal history. Instead, she portrayed the image of a local resident in Kenner, Louisiana. Her upbringing and social life were largely private, with no significant public persona before the events that unfolded. The circumstances leading up to the crime in June 2012 show escalating tension between Sanchez, her then-partner Terry Speaks, and Lockhart. Jaron, a dancer in the French Quarter, left work in the early hours of June 6th with Sanchez and Speaks reportedly in response to an invitation for a private party. There are indications that financial strain, emotional manipulation, and personal dynamics contributed to the tragic outcome. While no formal mental health diagnosis was presented, the situation reveals emotional instability, secrecy, and premeditated behavior. In the early morning of June 6th, Lockhart was taken to a home in Kenner. Within that residence, she was stabbed to death. In the days that followed, parts of her body washed ashore along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, prompting a waterfront forensic investigation. Authorities identified her remains and confirmed the cause of death as a stab wound to the chest. No graphic detail is necessary. This was a calculated act of violence, followed by a deliberate attempt to conceal the crime. investigators discovered that Sanchez and Speaks had planned invitations under false pretenses and may have manipulated Lockhart emotionally and financially. Surveillance and eyewitness accounts confirmed that they all left the club together at around 2:04 a.m. Witnesses club employees report Jaren departed, believing she was joining them for paid opportunity. License plate reading cameras placed the couple's vehicle in Mississippi, hours later corresponding with times when body parts were discovered along the coast. Sanchez was arrested in mid-2014. Initially charged with second-degree murder, obstruction, and conspiracy, she eventually accepted a plea deal in June 2016. Under the agreement, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter and the related obstruction charges. The judge sentenced her to 40 years in prison, the maximum for each count served concurrently. Her ex-boyfriend, Terry Speaks, received 2 life sentences after being convicted separately in 2015. Public and media response noted the collaboration with Lockhart's family in reaching the plea agreement. According to court reports, the deal was seen as a way to provide some measure of closure. Victims' advocates emphasized the grief and loss experienced by Lockhart's young child and family pain that will last a lifetime. Psychological interpretation of the case focused on motive and manipulation. Experts suggested that financial desperation, relational betrayal, and emotional coercion played more significant roles than mental illness. Sanchez appeared to facilitate the crime's execution and cover-up, disposing of evidence, coordinating with Speaks, and participating in a coded communications system afterward. Prosecutors described her as calculating and complicit rather than delusional or abnormally impaired. In the end, Margaret Sanchez's story is one of betrayal invitation under false promise and a brutal breach of trust. She once lived anonymously. Soon after, she became part of a case that shocked the Gulf Coast and revealed how violence can arise from manipulations masked as opportunity. We still got that Mississippi stuff over our heads she and Speaks referenced in coded exchanges. That chilling remark hints at how deliberately they concealed their actions and how the aftermath became as calculative as the crime itself. What remains is the question, how far can deception and emotional control travel down a fatal path when trust is twisted into tragedy? Number 5, Emma Jean Raine. Emma Jean Raine was 51 years old when, in August 2016, a New Orleans jury convicted her of second-degree murder in the 2006 shooting death of her second husband, Ernest Smith. She had held various jobs and was seen by many as engaging yet reserved. Prior to the case, her life remained largely private. No public controversies, just someone quietly known in the community. Over nearly 2 decades, 3 of Emma's husbands died under circumstances that raised suspicion. Her first partner died years earlier under unclear conditions. By 2006, Emma was married to Ernest, who held an $800 000 life insurance policy. Rumors circulated of an affair with James Raine, who would later become her third husband. Investigators ultimately linked Emma and James in a plot to benefit from Ernest's policy after his death. In early April 2006, Ernest Smith was shot inside his New Orleans home. Though initially treated as an isolated incident, there were no signs of forced entry, and Emma was the one to call 911. Police found spent shells near his motorcycle, and she described hearing a popping sound before discovering him collapsed on the stairs. As the case went cold for years, it resurfaced thanks to key testimony from relatives of Alfred Terry Everett, later identified as the alleged shooter. They reported Everett had confessed he was paid $10,000 by Emma and James Raine to kill Ernest. 2 of James's relatives testified that he and Emma had orchestrated the murder for hire. Subsequently, Everett was convicted in 2014. Emma was arrested in 2013 and charged shortly after as investigators connected life insurance changes and forged signatures. At trial in August 2016, prosecutors emphasized Emma's growing life insurance policy from $100 000 in the late 1990s to $800 000 by 2005, and that she removed herself as beneficiary, assigning James and Ernest's estate instead only weeks before the murder. They argued this showed premeditation and motivation. Emma's daughter was convicted of forging a signature to finalize benefits. Emma's defense claimed James Raine masterminded the plan, presenting her as manipulated rather than instigator. She denied direct involvement and pointed to lack of direct physical evidence tying her to the plot, but the jury heard testimony about phone calls, insurance documents, and confessions. Ultimately, on August 12, 2016, the jury found Emma guilty. The mandatory sentence, life in prison without parole, was handed down shortly thereafter. Her appeals, including arguments over hearsay evidence and procedural issues, were denied in 2018. Media coverage portrayed her as a classic black widow, a woman whose marriages ended in suspicion and who gained financially, while her supporters argued the case was built on hearsay public commentary focused on the pattern: 3 husbands, escalating wealth, and deadly outcomes. Psychological profiles offered at trial were limited, but observers portrayed Emma as calculating, financially driven, and unemotional in her planning. No serious mental health diagnosis was introduced. Instead, evidence pointed toward manipulation, secrecy, and pursuing gain disguised as grief. In the end, Emma Raine's story reveals a chilling intersection of affection and ambition. She once called the police in shock. Years later, the web of insurance documents and family testimony painted a far more deliberate picture. James and Emma got me to kill. Ernest Everett reportedly said words that echoed in court and sealed the fate of a woman who wore the guise of mourning beneath the weight of motive. What remains is a question: when affection turns fatal, how well can we truly read the shadows behind grief? Number 6, Dulce Maria Funez. Dulce Maria Funez was 31 years old when, in July 2021, she was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the April 2014 slayings of Eddie Earl Hall, 53, and his wife, Connie Hall, 51, in their home in Ethel, Louisiana. At the time, she had quietly been known as an employee in their painting business and lived a modest life with little public attention before the tragedy. Leading up to April 27th, 2014, tensions arose. Funez had been fired following a pay dispute, which reportedly angered her. Though no mental health diagnosis was made, investigators noted emotional instability and resentment. Witnesses recalled the dispute turning heated prior to the fatal incident. On the morning of April 27th, concerned family members checked in when Eddie and Connie couldn't be reached. Upon arriving at their house, they discovered Connie's body near the laundry room doorway and Eddie's remains later in the bedroom. Police reports described multiple stab wounds to both victims and signs of a violent struggle inside the home. Forensics found a hat at the scene linked by advanced DNA methods to Funez, involving a statistical match regarded as extremely significant. Investigators unraveled a plan involving Funez's boyfriend, Armando Reyes Diaz, who remains at large and was indicted alongside her. Witness testimony placed them in contact before the crime. DNA analysis through sophisticated software tied Funez to physical evidence found at the scene, notably the hat, while unknown male DNA matched a male accomplice. Records also placed cell phones and vehicle data in proximity to the crime scene, both before and after the murders. Funez fled the country soon after resurfacing in Germany in December 2015. German authorities detained her, and following court approval in June 2016, she was extradited back to Louisiana to face charges. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marshals Service offered rewards for information on Diaz. At trial in 2021, prosecutors presented detailed forensic evidence, including blood pattern analysis, DNA mixtures, cell phone logs, and fingerprints. They argued that Funez and Diaz conspired to kill the couple following the pay dispute after she had been employed by the Hall's painting company. Phone records, witness testimony, and data coordination further substantiated premeditation. A unanimous jury found her guilty of both counts of first-degree murder. The court imposed 2 consecutive life sentences without benefit of parole, probation, or suspension in accordance with Louisiana law. Appeals challenging sufficiency of evidence and identity-based arguments were rejected by appellate courts in 2022. Media and public reaction framed this case as a profound betrayal. A woman once trusted as employee and neighbor was now convicted of orchestrating the murder of the couple she once served. The family of the victims expressed a measure of closure upon conviction, though grief remained profound. Psychological assessments focused on motive and manipulation rather than mental illness. Experts at trial noted a constellation of deceit planning and concealment. Funez was depicted as someone who orchestrated betrayal, used technology and meticulous planning, and fled the country, demonstrating awareness of guilt rather than rash emotional reaction. In the end, Dulce Maria Funez's story is about how a workplace conflict escalated into a calculated double homicide. Trust shattered by anger, a carefully concealed plot, and a trail of forensic evidence that refused to disappear. We still got that Mississippi stuff over our heads, a cryptic phrase reportedly referenced by Funez and Diaz, became emblematic of how they hid in their actions and how their secrets eventually unraveled. This case forces us to ask, at what point does betrayal override loyalty, and how deeply can resentment lead a person to cross the ultimate moral boundary? Number 7, Sheila Camaille Fletcher. Sheila Camaille Fletcher was 66 years old when in March 2024, she and her husband pleaded no contest to manslaughter in the death of their 36-year-old daughter, Lacey Ellen Fletcher. Lacey had autism, was nonverbal, and had not left the family's home in Slaughter, Louisiana, for over a decade. Sheila held roles in local civic life and to the community appeared as a caring mother. Before the events came to light, neither she nor her husband had drawn public scrutiny. Beginning around 2002, Lacey withdrew from social environments and ceased attending school. Over time, she became increasingly homebound, confined to a leather sofa in the family living room. Despite a doctor's recommendation in 2010 that she receive medical and mental health care, no intervention occurred. Lacey's isolation, weight loss, and immobility escalated over 12 years, revealing a situation of emotional neglect, denial, and profound failure to protect. There is no record of formal psychiatric abuse. Rather, witnesses and medical professionals later described willful negligence and emotional avoidance. On January 3rd, 2022, Sheila placed a 911 call reporting her daughter was unresponsive. First responders arrived to find a house filled with an overpowering odor, human excrement, and evident signs of long-term filth. Lacey was discovered on the couch, her body fused into the cushions, weighing only 96 pounds, riddled with pressure ulcers and infection. The coroner classified her death as a result of sepsis, acute malnutrition, and bone infection due to prolonged neglect and immobility. Authorities responded swiftly. The coroner's office described the scene as one of the worst they had ever encountered. Medical testimony revealed advanced tissue breakdown and clear signs Lacey had received no medical or supportive care for years, during which she was wholly dependent on her parents. Community response was one of horror and shock. Many remarked that they had last seen a healthy-looking Lacey over a decade prior and had no idea of her decline. Sheila and her husband were initially charged with second-degree murder. In February 2024, they accepted a plea deal to reduce charges of manslaughter. The judge imposed a 40-year sentence with 20 years to be served and 20 years suspended, along with 5 years of supervised probation upon release. The parents expressed remorse in court, stating they could have done more, but prosecutors emphasized that their daughter was not capable of refusing care or making medical decisions. Lacey's inability to consent due to autism and her cognitive condition eliminated any suggestion she had chosen her fate. Psychological and medical experts at sentencing framed the case not as mental illness, but as a failure of caregivers. Testimony described Lacey's deterioration as preventable, with no evidence of abuse intended, but a grievous pattern of neglect grounded in denial and inaction. It was argued that the Fletchers had chosen the path of least resistance, allowing their daughter's body to deteriorate while maintaining the outward appearance of home care. In the end, Sheila Fletcher's story is one of tragic oversight, heartbreak, and catastrophic erosion of familial duty. Her daughter sat in isolation, invisible to those around her, until death could not be ignored. They loved her to death, proclaimed their defense attorney, a chilling phrase that crystallizes the paradox of affection used to rationalize neglect. This case forces us to consider when caregiving becomes neglect, when love becomes omission, how deeply can denial become cruelty? Number 8, Bunnak Landon. Bunnak Landon was in her 40s at the time of her conviction in May 2025. She had worked under the stage name Valentina, performing along the Gulf Coast, then lived quietly in Harahan, Louisiana, cohabitating with her partner and caring for his young daughters. To much of the community, she was an involved caregiver, not a public figure, but someone relatively familiar to neighbors and friends. In the weeks before April 25th, 2023, Bella Fontanelle, age 6, lived with her sister in their father's home under a custody arrangement. Teachers and the child's sister reported Bella often cried about being with Landon and said aloud, "Miss Hannah is mean to me." Her school records documented increasing anxiety tears on drop-off and declining grades. There was no formal mental health diagnosis reported, but observations from educators and family hinted at emotional distress and discomfort in the household. On the evening of April the 25th, the girls' paternal grandmother dropped them off at their father's home while he worked late. Surveillance video later showed Landon pulling a blue wagon carrying a large bucket at approximately 9:30 p.m. A few minutes later, she wheeled the same bucket, now empty, past Bella's mother's house, one street over. Investigators later concluded Bella had been inside that bucket. Bella was later discovered inside the bucket left on her mother's front lawn shortly after sunrise. The bucket was identified as Bella's when her maternal grandmother found it outside. Inside Bella's body had evidence of strangulation and blunt force trauma. Pathologists noted abrasions consistent with fingernail marks and concluded she may have still been unconscious but alive when placed inside. Death was ruled asphyxia due to strangulation and trauma. Police traced Landon to a local hospital later that night. She buried her phone in a nearby lot and asked her sister to contact her attorney. She left text messages to friends saying things like, "Always remember me as Valentina," and began searching online for criminal defense lawyers. Investigators recovered her phone from the burial site and found searches and communications consistent with planning and covering her tracks. Her trial took place in early May 2025. The jury unanimously rejected her insanity plea, deliberating for under an hour before convicting her of first-degree murder and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. A forensic psychiatrist testified she suffered from PTSD rooted in childhood trauma, but the prosecution's expert described her behavior as methodical and indicative of goal-directed planning, pointing to awareness and intent rather than psychosis. During impact statements, Bella's 9-year-old sister spoke bravely about crying the night before and recounting episodes of unfair punishment. Teachers described constant anxiety in the classroom. The courtroom also heard from family members who stated Landon had sought to manipulate her image and bury evidence. Jurors were shown surveillance footage and messages from Landon and given physical items like the bucket and wagon to view. On May 6th, 2025, Judge Nancy Miller sentenced Landon to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the obstruction counts, she received an additional 80 years ordered to run consecutively to the life term. The judge stated in court evil was on full display and declared, "This court never wants you to see the light of day again." Psychological insights from the prosecution framed Landon as cold and calculated with traits of narcissism and a rigid belief she should be in charge of Bella's upbringing. Her own psychologist noted traumatic memory loss, but struggled to assert she was legally insane. The defense claimed she could not distinguish right from wrong at the time, while the state argued she deleted texts, buried her phone, and intentionally created an illusion, clear signs of deliberate action. In the end, Bunnak Landon's story is one of betrayal disguised as care, and a child's last moments hidden under layers of deception. A caregiver turned killer who walked away as if nothing happened. "I'm at peace with what I've decided to do," Landon wrote to a friend just before she surrendered, a line that echoes through court documents and leaves one chilling question. How do we judge intent when a goodbye reads like a confession? Number 9, Nadia Braxton. Nadia Braxton was 29 years old in July 2011 when she carried out one of the most heartbreaking murder-suicides in Louisiana's recent history. A mother of 3 living in Kenner, she was known by friends and neighbors as quiet and devoted to her children. Outwardly, she appeared loving and family-oriented, often seen walking her eldest daughter to school and caring for her 2 younger babies. Beneath that quiet surface, however, financial pressures and emotional isolation were beginning to mount. Nadia's early life was closely tied to her church community. She grew up attending services, was baptized as a teenager, and remained active in her congregation into adulthood. After Hurricane Katrina destroyed their original church in 2005, her attendance faded. The disconnection from this once central part of her life left her with fewer emotional supports, even as her responsibilities as a young mother increased. By 2011, she and her partner, Ronald Peters, were raising 3 daughters, 12-year-old Kayla toddler Naya and infant Neela. Ronald worked long hours, sometimes holding multiple jobs, to support the household. Despite his efforts, the family faced foreclosure on their home, a devastating blow that Nadia kept largely to herself. Court records revealed the house had twice been seized for non-payment, and by early July, eviction was imminent. In the days leading up to July 12th, Nadia reached out to someone from her past, her former pastor. In emails, she expressed feelings of hopelessness, anxiety, and uncertainty about whether she belonged in the world at all. The pastor responded with prayers and scripture inviting her to call. She did call that Tuesday morning, but he was tied up with children's programs at the church and returned her call hours later. By then, it was too late. That evening, Ronald returned home from work to find the house silent. As he climbed the stairs, he discovered his 3 daughters and their mother lying on the same bed. A handgun registered to Nadia rested at the foot of the bed. Investigators later confirmed she had shot each of the children before turning the gun on herself. Police found no signs of struggle or outside involvement. It was a tragedy entirely contained within the walls of their home. The community reacted with shock and grief. Neighbors who rarely heard arguments or saw conflict in the family struggled to understand how despair could fester unnoticed. Even Ronald admitted he never recognized signs of severe depression in Nadia, saying she never seemed deeply troubled to him. Friends and relatives echoed the same disbelief that someone so devoted to her children could be driven to such an act. Psychologists who later reviewed the case pointed to the combined weight of financial stress, social withdrawal, and untreated depression. It was not a sudden outburst, but a slow internal collapse that ended in irreversible loss. In the end, Nadia Braxton's story forces a painful question. How often do quiet struggles remain invisible until it's too late? And when the signs of despair go unnoticed, what more can be done to prevent such tragedies from unfolding in silence? Number 10, Antoinette Frank. Antoinette Frank was just 23 years old when she shocked New Orleans and the nation by committing one of the most notorious crimes in the city's history. A rookie police officer sworn to protect the public, she instead orchestrated a deadly robbery at a family-owned Vietnamese restaurant, an act that would leave 3 innocent people dead, including a fellow officer. Frank's early life was turbulent. Born in 1971, she grew up in a fractured family marked by instability and allegations of abuse. Reports later revealed strained relationships with both parents and a brother who had multiple run-ins with the law. From a young age, Antoinette dreamed of becoming a police officer, clinging to the idea that a badge and uniform might provide the belonging and authority she lacked in her personal life. Despite red flags during her application, including failed psychological evaluations and troubling inconsistencies on her background checks, she was hired by the New Orleans Police Department in 1993. Within months, her performance raised concerns among colleagues but severe staffing shortages kept her on the force. Around this time, she met 18-year-old Rogers Lacaze, an alleged drug dealer. The two quickly entered a secret relationship that blurred professional boundaries and spiraled into criminal behavior. By early 1995, Frank had secured off-duty work as a security guard at the Camaille restaurant in eastern New Orleans. The family who owned the restaurant trusted her, as did Officer Ronald Williams, who also worked security there. But Frank's loyalty lay elsewhere with Lacaze, and with a growing plan to rob the restaurant for cash. In the early morning hours of March 4th, 1995, the restaurant was closing for the night. Family members were cleaning up when Frank and Lacaze returned for a third time that evening. Using a stolen key, they gained entry. What followed was chaos. Witnesses later recounted hearing commands shouted, frantic searching for money, and multiple gunshots. By the end of the night, Officer Williams and siblings Ha and Quang Vu were dead. 2 other family members survived by hiding in a cooler, later providing critical testimony. Frank attempted to cover her tracks by returning to the crime scene posing as a responding officer, but inconsistencies in her story, combined with eyewitness identification and physical evidence, quickly unraveled her deception. She and Lacaze were arrested the same day. Their trials were swift. Lacaze was convicted first, followed by Frank just weeks later. Both were sentenced to death, making Antoinette Frank one of only 2 women on Louisiana's death row. Subsequent investigations even uncovered human remains beneath her former home, suspected to be her missing father, though no additional charges were brought. Psychologists later described Frank as manipulative, emotionally detached, and deeply influenced by personal trauma. Yet jurors were unmoved. The calculated nature of the crime left little room for leniency. Decades later, Antoinette Frank remains on death row, a stark reminder of how power once entrusted to protect can be turned toward unthinkable betrayal. She wore the badge, one prosecutor said, but she abandoned everything it stood for. Number 11, Amy Hebert. Amy Hebert was 40 years old when the unthinkable happened in the quiet community of Matthews, Louisiana. Known by friends and neighbors as a devoted mother and active member of her local church, Hebert seemed from the outside to live a modest but stable life. She worked as a teacher's aide and was described as quiet, kind, and deeply involved in raising her 2 young children, Camaille and Braxton. But beneath that calm exterior, an inner turmoil was building, one that would lead to tragedy. Hebert's personal life had unraveled in the years leading up to the murders. Her marriage to Chad Hebert ended in divorce in 2006, and custody of their 2 children was shared. The split was contentious, and when Chad remarried shortly after, tensions grew. Friends would later testify that Amy struggled with resentment and feelings of abandonment, even as she attempted to keep up appearances of normalcy. By 2007, Amy Hebert was battling severe depression. She reported hearing voices, and psychiatric experts would later argue over whether she suffered from a psychotic break or a controlled act of revenge. Her journals and statements revealed deep fears about losing her children, combined with anger toward her ex-husband and his new wife. Those emotions, unchecked and untreated, escalated over months. On August 20th, 2007, the tension reached its breaking point. That morning, Camaille, 9, and Braxton, 7, failed to appear at school. When calls went unanswered, family members grew concerned. Amy had not shown up for work, and her car sat parked at the home. Chad's father, R.J. Hebert, drove to the house to check on them. Inside, he discovered a harrowing scene: the children dead, and Amy gravely injured from self-inflicted wounds. Authorities rushed her to the hospital, where she survived and was taken into custody later that day. The investigation revealed layers of complexity. Suicide notes written by Amy accused her ex-husband of betrayal and vowed he would never have the children. Prosecutors argued this showed calculated malice rather than delusion. The defense countered, pointing to Amy's history of depression, auditory hallucinations, and religious fears, claiming she acted in a state of psychosis believing her children were safer with her than living apart. In 2009, after a highly publicized trial, Amy Hebert was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The jury considered the death penalty but could not reach a unanimous decision, resulting in a sentence of life in prison without parole. To this day, she remains incarcerated at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women. Psychologists continue to debate Hebert's mental state. At the time of the murders, was this an act of untreated mental illness or an act of vengeance against her ex-husband? The answer may never be fully known, as one juror later reflected. There were no winners in that courtroom, only heartbreak for everyone involved. Number 12, Brandy Aileen Holmes. Brandy Aileen Holmes was born July 25, 1979. At 23 years old, she stood trial in Caddo Parish, Louisiana, after the New Year's Day 2003 invasion and killing of retired minister Julian Brandon Sr., age 68. Holmes was working a robbery with her boyfriend, Robert Coleman. From the community's perspective, Holmes had no violent history. Her earlier years were marked by academic struggles and behavioral issues, but never criminal notoriety. Holmes' childhood was deeply troubled. She suffered prenatal exposure to alcohol. Later experts confirmed fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, and endured learning disabilities, special education placement, and cognitive limitations. Her mother testified she named her daughter Brandy after her favorite drink. From an early age, Brandy exhibited developmental delays and emotional dysregulation. Yet, despite psychological red flags, she was never placed in consistent mental health services or protective programs. On January 1st, 2003, Holmes and Coleman knocked on the Brandon home in Blanchard, Louisiana. When Reverend Brandon answered, they forced their way in. Brandon was shot, and when he did not immediately die, stabbed multiple times. His wife Alice was shot and critically wounded, and though she survived, she suffered permanent disability and died 5 years later. Holmes was arrested 5 days later, after neighbors reported she had been bragging about the murders and selling the couple's jewelry. Police investigation uncovered Holmes's confession. She also led authorities to the body of a third victim, Terrence Blaze, whom she implicated with Coleman's involvement. Her confession tape was allegedly destroyed by flushing it down a toilet at the police station, another act prosecutors cited as consciousness of guilt. At her trial in early 2006, Holmes pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. The prosecution emphasized these aggravating factors: the victim's age over 65, the occurrence during armed robbery and risk of fatal harm to multiple people. The jury unanimously sentenced her to death. Throughout the penalty phase, Holmes's attorneys presented expert testimony demonstrating her mental limitations due to FAS. Her mother, psychologists, and neuroimaging experts testified she functioned for all practical purposes at a 10 to 12-year-old level and lacked full appreciation of her actions. But the jury rejected this mitigation, focusing instead on the calculated nature of the crime. Holmes appealed to the Louisiana Supreme Court, arguing her developmental impairments should preclude a death sentence. In a narrow 5-2 decision, the court upheld her conviction and sentence as proportional and consistent with capital punishment statutes. In 2016, the trial court vacated her death sentence, resentencing her to life without parole after procedural defects in jury selection were found. Public reaction was mixed. Some viewed her as a dangerous criminal beyond redemption. Others, including advocates for FAS awareness, saw her as a profoundly impaired individual who should never have faced capital punishment. The National Organization on Fetal Alcohol Syndrome supported her appeal, stating her ability to conform to the law was very seriously impaired. Psychologically, experts framed Holmes not as evil, but as cognitively impaired. She lacked empathy, judgment, impulse control, and had significant structural brain abnormalities consistent with FAS. Still at trial, the jury concluded that mitigating factors did not outweigh the deliberate violence of the crime. In the end, Brandy Holmes' story underscores a tragic collision of developmental disability and brutal violence. A woman impaired from birth stands accused of calculated murder, and a justice system more focused on punishment than nuanced mercy. Her capacity to appreciate the criminality of her actions is very seriously impaired, said one expert, a haunting line that asks us, when someone cannot fully reason, how should society measure culpability?